Hi Wizards, my name is Manuel, better known as Phemo in the poker world. I am a high-stakes MTT player and coach, and I recently joined the GTO Wizard team. In my sessions I will explore GTO strategies with you and break down the mechanics in an implementable way to help you improve your win rate at the tables. I hope to see many of you guys in my live seminars. Let's get to the next level together. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of an overview what to expect today. We will first of all try to understand when this spot actually happens in-game, in theory, how ranges are composed when we get to this node, and how ranges are going to change as well on the turn, when the turn card is being dealt. Then we will look at brief concepts at play, nothing special, probably stuff that you have heard already quite often. And the most important thing, we will actually try to understand the mechanics on different turn clusters, how strategies change and function on different turns, depending on the board structure. And then we will briefly sum it up with a conclusion and outlook. What we've learned during the session, hopefully, and what you have to keep in mind when you study the spot yourself, but also what you can expand on when you want to deepen your knowledge further in the spot, because of course, you can always only cover so much in a 1 hour coaching, and there's very much to explore in these turns and river nodes. So just briefly, when does the spot happen? Of course, when we look at turn probes, it is a necessity that the flop went check. And that happens more often when the ranges are wider, especially the in-position range. Here I've compared two frequencies, two aggregated frequencies, 40 BB scenarios. One's big blind versus under the gun and big blind versus the button. And you can see that under the gun checks much less than the button, just because the range equity of the under the gun player is much higher. This is just a general mechanic in MTT poker, because with the pre-flop odds, the big blind is always getting. The big blind ranges react a little bit more lazy than in-position ranges, the raise first in ranges, and therefore imbalance, let's call it, between the equities gets a little bit bigger when the raise comes from early position. So, and when the under the gun player has more equity, he can bet more often. So it's going to go check less often. But also in wide range scenarios, and the mechanics are also more interesting because there's a wider range of hands available to play. And that always is a better example, in my opinion, to understand strategies well. So here we can see the button checks 25% approximately globally. 40 BB button big blind doesn't really change too much for different stack sizes as a global percentage, I think. But it is very dependent on the actual board structure. And there are very specific boards where there's a lot of checking and many boards where there's no checking at all. And c-betting itself can probably fill at least another coaching. So I need to cut a few things a little bit short today, but I still briefly want to give you an impression how to identify nodes where starting is worth it. One big driver, and we will actually look at an example for the hand selection in a minute as well, but one big driver for the in-position range especially is boards where in-position has a lot of medium strength hands. And one thing that is important to understand both on the flop and on the turn, when you have a medium strong hand and you invest a bet and therefore let the other guy react, that always means the responding range is becoming a little bit tighter, weak hands are going to fold, and when you start out with a medium strong hand and you bet, ranges are going to get tighter, and then your equity is actually getting lower. And that could potentially be a problem. Usually it's a bit more of an issue when you are out of position or in certain boards, but something to keep in mind. So not every hand is interested in betting. Then sometimes the board is just very, very good from a range perspective for the big blind. My example for that would be 765 Rainbow. I called it fair equity for out of position because big blind is never going to have a huge amount of equity in big blind defense boards, especially not against the button, or actually also not against an earlier position, but usually is not going to pass 50% equity very often. Just because he has so many hands that don't connect with any given flop. And then the third big factor is a top range advantage for the out of position player for the big blind. That is not very frequently happening, but on paired boards with a bottom paired flop, for example, where the big blind has many more combinations of the trips that are available. So these are important as well. So let's quickly touch on range composition. And after that, we will have a look in GTO Wizard how the boards actually look like and how ranges function on these boards. So when we want to give the in position range something like a headline, we can call it condensed. And now when we think about turn play, we could actually, I think it's pretty helpful to think about the spot as it would be played in live poker, because there the game is a little bit slower and we can understand what actually happens a bit better. When the big blind checks the flop, he kind of makes a statement with his range. He says, I didn't want to lead, at least my hand or my range doesn't want to lead. But the statement is not very strong because in most scenarios, big blind will not have a leading range. But it's a little bit of a statement. However, when he checks, when in position checks, that's defining ranges much more, and that's what I call condensed here. Condensed means the top and the bottom is missing. So we are now talking about the range that is more centered around the middle, medium strength hands of the in position player. And in live poker, it's very well to observe when in position checks. Now the dealer is going to tap the table, going to burn a card, and that is actually a very good moment to think about range compositions in this scenario. Because now ranges are defined in a way, and the turn can change them again. But at this particular moment, we can observe ranges, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And at this moment, in position's range is condensed because he has bet most of his strong hands, some of his bluffs, but especially the medium strength hands that I talked about on the last slide already are the ones interested in checking the most. So his range is built very much around mate hands, like hands that are a pair but smaller than top pair. So a lot of second pair type hands, third pair type hands, under pockets, things like that. The other hand category that falls into this cluster is what I call showdownable air. So these are usually going to be ace high hands, strong king high hands that have decent equity right now, like 40, 50% maybe. And then the concept I talked about in the beginning kicks in when you now start betting, you trim down big blind's range a little bit and your hand is going to suffer in equity again, which is can potentially be problematic, still having to play a turn and river. But then again, we're in position, so it's not that drastic, more of a choice that we can make as the in-position player. Whenever there are range splits, especially between betting and checking, then draws usually are present in almost all the ranges just to have board coverage and all the run-outs, but also because there are draws that have a bigger incentive to do one of the two things. So there's also going to be a variety of draws in the in-position range, and some strong hands for protection. Usually ones that cover the board quite a lot, so they block a lot of the continue range from the big blind. Top sets is a typical example, but it also depends a little bit on the specific board structure. In any case, the in-position range is condensed when he checks the flop, but there is no turn card yet. Big blind range, as I said, is rather undefined. Most often it's going to be just a full pre-flop defense range. He calls pre-flop, checks range on the flop, so nothing is really set yet. But on some boards, he's going to have leads as well. Boards like 7-6-5 Rainbow are a perfect example. But still, usually the ranges are going to be built in a way where the remainder, the checking range, is still kind of reflective of the full range that he has pre-flop. So big blind's range is rather undefined at this particular moment. I am asking question, high monotone boards, I guess the question is in the check cluster because the big blind has a flush advantage. I think, yeah, there are usually boards that have a lot of equity shifts, which monotone boards are one of. Always checked to some degree, but I usually try to focus on the more frequent scenarios when I start studying a spot or start coaching a spot, because it's just more impactful what you can take away from, and monotone boards are just relatively rare. So I rather try to ignore them in the first step at least, but we can have a follow-up on more exotic spots in the future for sure. So two classic examples of the check boards are going to be boards like high, mid, two connected cards that connect very well with the big blinds. the bottom ones, and then boards like 973 Rainbow. The typical thing about this board is that there are gut shots between all the cards, which are more present in the big blind range because he has more offsuit combinations. But as I said, we need to be a little bit careful not to dive too deep into the flop strategy today. So just briefly exploring one example, the Queen 8-6 flush draw board, to understand the flop check ranges. First of all, we can see that the button checks around 50% here, which is relatively typical. Usually you will have a hard time to find boards where the button is going to check more than 50%. The only exception would be if you had boards like 765 Rainbow and would forbid the big blind to lead, then check frequencies are going to surpass the 50% benchmark quite significantly. If not, this is around the maximum check frequency approximately you will find. And then looking at the equity graph here, I think is very helpful to understand why there is a bunch of checks, because in contrast to a board like 765 Rainbow on Queen 8-6, having a check range is more of a decision for the button. You could simplify a strategy to a relatively small bet that would lose very little EV, but could bet at a very high frequency. Not pure, but probably something like 80–85%. You could do that, but the GTO solution doesn't really think it's the best idea. And the main reason are, first of all, that the in-position player is going to have a lot of hands that are in the, let's call it 50% cluster. As I said, in reality, it's more like 40–50, 40–55. But these kind of hands are not really interested in making ranges tighter yet, but rather retaining their equity, realizing in a smaller pot. But it is usually never one single factor that drives these mechanics. Here we have a second one, and that is that the big blind range has very, very little absolute auto folds. So not too many super low equity hands that are going to always want to fold against a small bet. So these factors kind of play together and make it a board where we want to check a little bit as the in-position player. And 973 Rainbow works very similarly. Actually, most of the boards work very similarly. And then when we look at the check range from the button, we can see that a lot of the green hands are going to be in the pair section, as I said. And then there's a little bit of top pair checking as well. That's more of a protection play, but the main hand categories that want to check are going to be pairs that are lower than the top pair itself. And then when we look at ace high and king high hands, we can also see that the worse kind of king high hands and the worse ace high hands want to bet a little bit more compared to the stronger hands that could maybe more intuitively be understood as showdownable air, as I called it. And you can also see the equities here. They are usually in the 40–50% percentile. All right. So I think that shows pretty well how the in-position range is going to be constructed, very condensed, trimmed down around hands that have decent equity right now, but not necessarily stronger than top pair. Then briefly checking on the concepts at play. One very important thing is, of course, position. We are looking at the big blind strategy today, playing the turn first in, and we are out of position. And that is something very important to keep in mind. I will touch on a few examples where it plays or how the role it plays manifests in the strategies. It always plays a role, of course. And then, as always, equity play a role. But there are 2 or 3 different equities we can have a look at in this scenario. First of all, the range equity. How is our range, all of our hands going to do at all? And usually when you have a stronger range, a higher range equity, we are going to bet more often. And we will see in examples later how exactly that works, why it is, and what kind of hands it affects the most. Another equity we need to consider is the nut equity, the equity of the very strongest hands in a range. And there it's important to understand 2 things. Who has more of these hands, and does one of the players have them exclusively? So more of these hands usually is going to be, depending on the board structure. Like when you have very high turns, for example, we will see that later, the in-position player is going to hit them more often. And so one pair hands can be the nuts, or we can have a straight completer where a lot of 2 pairs and straights are possible, that maybe the big blind has more because it's a low board. And or it could be a high board where, let's say, for example, on Queen 8-6-7, something like that, or Queen 8-6-9, the in position player will also have hands like Jack 10, will also turn more 2 pairs than on 7-6-5-4. And therefore, it also depends if one player has the nuts exclusively or if both players have them. When we look at turn props, we also need to consider that in GTO, the in position player is also going to have some traps. So usually we need to consider the top 10 to 15% of the range, the nut equity part, because in many scenarios, in positions traps from the flop will still be the best hands on the turn, but they only represent a very, very small fraction of the range and therefore are not sufficient to prevent higher aggression from the big blind. And the last type of equity I want to touch on a few times is equity over time. Equity over time means, is the equity distribution drastically going to change on future cards? In this example, the time is not very long anymore. It's just going to be the river, so only one card, but it can still manifest in ranges in certain ways, in strategies. And it can either be driven by the board, but it can also be driven by hand classes. I try to explain the whole process of going through the flop and the turn with the live poker example. Big blind checks, that defines the range. Button checks, that defines the range much more. Now we need to look at equities and understand what equity distributions look like and what the effect is in strategies. And this is especially helpful because sometimes the turn doesn't change anything at all. And those are bricks. And I think this is a very nice situation to take as a baseline, to understand basically we are still having checked through the flop and we haven't seen a turn card yet basically. And now we understand how ranges would play on a brick turn and deviate from there if necessary. So this spot I saved in the AI for us to be able to experiment with a few things and to change settings a little bit. So when we go to ranges, something that is always, almost always the case is that the big blind is going to have a very weak range part. And that is just the case because he has defended the wide preflop and there's always going to be a lot of hands that don't connect with the board at all, no matter what the board is. So he's always going to have a lot of very weak hands that don't really interact with the board at all and just most of the time need to give up, with a few exceptions that I will explain later. And then we can have a look at the top range, for example. Here I'm circling more like the top 25% of hands, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we can see that the big blind consistently has more equity than the button in these scenarios when basically the flop was checked through and there was no equity shift on the turn at all. One thing I also mentioned is that here we can see that actually the button still has the absolute nut advantage in the very, very top 2% or so of the range. But as I said, that doesn't really prevent big blind from showing a lot of aggression, which we can see in the large sizing that he is using. So it's more about looking at the top 10, 20% of range, depending on the board exactly, to define strategies. And this is basically the typical example for no equity shifts at all. The turn is completely irrelevant. What's going to happen is the big blind is going to have the stronger top range. He still has an undefined range, so he's all the top pairs, all the 2 pairs, all the sets he's going to have in a given scenario. And the in-position player doesn't have them anymore. He has bet most of his strong hands on the flop, so he lost them in the check-check line. And he's only going to have a very tiny fraction of traps that he's going to use to defend the turn. Then another thing we can see is here in this specific example, like in the medium range, there's nothing to be said really. And in the bottom range, as I said, the button is always going to be ahead. Like his air that he checked is showdownable, or so it's relatively strong while the big blind still has a lot of trash. The range advantage for big blind, I assume is the question, is usually always prevalent when there is no equity shift on the turn. I will also conclude this in the end. We usually always have a scenario on the turn that the big blind has a bottom range disadvantage. He's still going to have a lot of weak hands that haven't improved at all. And then who has the nuts depends a lot on the turn. And in the moment where the dealer burns the card and no turn has been dealt yet, most of the time, big blind is going to have a top range advantage, even though he might be behind in the absolute, top 2 to 5% or whatever. What is very typical for bricks is that we are going to have a very, very big bet. Like the main strategy here is going to be built around 2x pot, and everything else is relatively irrelevant. We have a small frequency of B50 to B25, but that can be ignored for the most part. We will see a little bit when it becomes really relevant. If we want to put it in a very simplistic model, it's not very important part of the strategy. What is important is the huge overbet, and that is something that I also see is one of the biggest population leaks, that people just don't apply big enough pressure in these spots. They don't use sufficiently big sizings to represent their actual equity distribution. And one thing why this is so important to use, when we look at the turn strategies, we always want to accomplish something in the range that we are playing against. And when we use really, really big sizings here, we're going to see that a lot of the overcards have to fold in the in-position range. And here's to continue most of his mate hands. He can fold a bunch of lower pairs, but he has to kind of bluff catch with his second pair type hands, and he is going to fold with his overcards. And that is very important, because applying this concept on the turn gives us the option to go very thin for value on the river, because there's very little equity shifts going to happen now. So we made sure that equity over time is pretty stable. If you imagined you would have bet small if the river is a king or something like that, or a jack, in positions range would improve much more often. That is a little bit problematic for our 9x, because as we saw here, our main hand class that wants to apply this strategy is going to be top pairs. So they are relatively vulnerable, because every overcard could potentially change equities, depends a little bit on the river arriving ranges. But when we bet this big, there's very little equity shifts possible, just because of the folding range from the button on the turn. And also we're going to produce a relatively low stack to pot ratio on the river, which also allows us to value bet a little bit wider. But I also want to show you an example where I think it's very important to have block strategies, because we need to differentiate undercards in hands or turns that don't change equity distributions at all, as I said, or undercards or turns that connect with the board. So they don't really change the equity distribution of the overcards. We remember the button checked a lot of high cards, king, queen, ace 10, all these kind of holdings, and they still didn't change at all on the turn when an undercard like the 5 here hits. But the big blind is going to gain a very big advantage in the upper half of the region. So now we are talking more about equity of the range. You can see here, the big blind is going to have 50% equity compared to 47 on the brick. Again, this doesn't seem very high, just because of the fact that the big blind carries so much trash in its range that it's completely irrelevant to the spot, and it's not going to really influence ranges too much. It just plays because it got good pre-flop odds, and now it hasn't connected. It's going to give up a lot. In any way, now though, we can see that we have a very relevant and high frequency block bet, and we can also see another thing, that our big bet sizing has decreased in sizing a little bit. And let's explore these two mechanics a little bit in GTO Wizard as well. So we are going to look at a 5 on the turn, and I mainly want to touch on two different kind of concepts here. First of all, the downsize of the big bet, and second of all, the emerging block bet. I mean, it was there before, but we saw it wasn't as relevant as it is today. Let's trim this down a little bit. to B25 and B125 just to have a clearer cut strategy here. But we can also talk a little bit about why this betting pattern changes at all in a second. So now you can see compared to, I think, 15% small bet before, we are almost at 30. So this has become much more important. And that has a bunch of reasons. Like, first of all, we can see in the equity distribution, what I just showed you, the whole big blind range has improved a lot, especially in the middle. So range equity, we gained a lot of that. And for that reason, we want to bet more. The nut equity hasn't changed too much. Now the traps from the flop that in position had, pocket nines or whatever, are not the absolute nuts anymore because we have more 6-8, 6-4 type hands. But that's not really the relevant driver of the strategy. The relevant driver is the stronger medium hands. Now our medium strength hands are not only a 7 but also a 5. So there's a completely new cluster of hands that has emerged that is also incentivized to block bet in order to extract value from in positions high cards. He's still going to have to call ace highs and king highs against our small bets. So that is very nice to extract some value with our 5 here. And he's going to have still a lot of pairs that are a 5 or even worse themselves and need to continue. So we can also extract some value from mate hands. And if we take a closer look at the pairs below top pair that actually want to bet, we can see that many of them are either going to have a relatively high kicker, so they can actually extract some value from the in position range, from the second pairs or under pockets the button does have, but many of them also have something else going on for them. They have great equity over time. They have the option to improve on the river as well. They are going to have a lot of gut shots going with their pair. Because that is the main difference when we look at the 973 deuce versus the 975. Not only has the 5x as a new hand cluster emerged, but also a lot of the mate hands that were relatively indifferent between checking and betting on the other example now gained in equity by having additional equity on the river by making straights, and that incentivizes them a little bit more to go for the thin value on the turn. Because again, considering position, it is always a little bit of a thin trade-off to go for block sales out of position because you are trimming down ranges from in position, and you are usually, so first of all, that decreases your equity, but then again, you cannot really prevent the button from realizing a lot of equity, right? He's still going to call a lot of his mate hands, so he's still going to hit a lot of rivers on all different kinds of runouts. Therefore, equity denial is very hard to accomplish here. And being out of position, it is not a great strategy to build a pot that you are not going to win very, very often. So for that reason, on these kind of turns where there's additional equity emerging for the mate hands, for the smaller pairs, it's very, very good to implement this strategy compared to the brick turn. Another thing that is also important to understand, when you implement a small bet strategy, you're always going to have to sacrifice a few of your very strong hands in order to be able to defend against this aggression on the turn when he raises you. Of course, very questionable how realistic this is in real games, but we are talking about GTO poker, about balanced strategies. And here in these scenarios, you have to sacrifice some of the hands that are stronger than second pair to be integrated in the small bet range, so you can actually continue against raises sufficiently and still be uncapped there. And that is, for example, just not a trade-off that is worth it on 973 deuce to sacrifice some strong hands that have a huge gain in protection by betting 2x point against the overcards to be able to bet more of relatively indifferent hands like a 7 with a small size. But here, first of all, we have a wider variety of hands available. We have straights, more 2 pairs that weren't existing on the brick turn. There we just had top pairs or worse. So we have more hands to choose from that we could potentially sacrifice as a block bet. And then again, we also just have stronger hands. Absolutely speaking, we have straights now. But if this river turn is so good for the big blind, why do we downsize then with our big sizing is the questions we could ask ourselves. And the reason for that is equity over time to some degree. When we bet B125 here, in position has to defend most of his mate hands, most of his pairs. I think for humans, it's very hard to grasp the difference in continuing ranges for B125 to B200 or something like that. It just for us feels like an overbet and we have to fold a lot. But if we would bet 2x pot here, there would be rivers where out of position would just plummet so much in equity. Because if we would do that, or let's actually add it, if we would bet really, really large here, Button would fold a lot of his mate hands, but would continue some of his draws. And then on some rivers, for example, a 6, where the remaining relatively weak mate hands still improve, or a club, for example, big blind's range would become so weak or would have so little options to extract additional value because now in position has folded most of his relatively weak mate hands on the turn already, and now he's improving a lot, and that is just a spot that solvers try to avoid. Of course, it's only going to be a few specific rivers, but when you consider the whole game tree, it becomes relevant. So when equity over time becomes a little bit worse, boards become a little bit more dynamic, then usually the top sizing decreases a bit. We just bet a little bit smaller in order to keep the continuing range of the other player wide enough so we don't create very bad river spots for ourselves. And this is not a black and white thing, it's a sliding scale. You could continue this trend, you could make the board 9736 and the top sizing would probably be B100, and you could make it 9738 and the top sizing would become B75. So it's more like a trend that emerges through the board structures than an absolute set in stone strategy you're going to see, but it's very helpful to understand the logic behind it. So that's undercards. And the other side of the coin is overcards, of course. And while, for example, a brick is a card that doesn't change equity at all, usually an overcard is going to be an equity shift to some degree in position's favor, right? He checked a lot of ace, king, king, queen type hands on the flop, and now he's improving to top pairs on the turn with some of his ace air hands. And so his condensed range is improving in a little bit of a part, and also hands like queen check are picking up now equity, queen 10 are picking up equity. So you can see that the button regains his top range advantage. So that's important to understand when we think about range composition, to think about it before we actually think about the turn card and consider that one as well, because this can change things a little bit again, as we see here. So now what we can see, when we lose our top range advantage that we had on the undercards, we are also going to lose our big sizing. No nut equity advantage, no big bets. Very classic example. But we're still going to have a block bet, and we will talk about why in a second. This can, of course, have differing degrees of magnitude. You can have cards that are, first of all, connected to the flop in terms of the overcard, like the 973 connects more with the 8x, the 10-9s, the 9-7s, and so on. And then the king, which is very disconnected, but it also differs in height. And very simply speaking, the higher the card, the better it is going to be for the in-position player. An ace is better than a king, is better than a queen, is better than a jack, and so on and so forth. And what we will see following this trend is the higher the card, the lower the betting frequency is going to be for the big blind, because the card is going to be worse for him. And then the second thing, like, for example, having sizings bigger than a block, is more about the connectedness of the board. But what you will usually never see is overbets here on these kind of boards. I will show you another example later as well, because it is a slight equity shift in position's favor. Here, for example, you can see that he clearly gains the top range advantage again. Now he's ahead again in terms of strong hands. Here it's more like even, but we are out of position. And that is reason enough for us not to start building a pot too liberally and rather play different strategies for reasons that we are going to talk about now. So let's use the king as an example that illustrates a bunch of things. Like, first of all, of course, we are still going to have strong hands, just as in the button, but we are going to be out of position. What is important here is this range part where the button is going to have a lot of stronger pairs than we do. And in GTO world, Mauro has already addressed it. There is very much aggression, especially on equity shifts against block bets. So when we block bet, the in-position player is going to raise 25% of the time. And that is very questionable if that happens in reality. So when we decide to implement a block bet strategy only, that is not only a function of our ranges, but also relying on the fact that our opponent is helping us build a pot. He's going to raise for us to some degree. So that is one function that is going on here that is very questionable if that happens in reality. Today, I want to stay focused on GTO logics for the most part, just because there's quite a lot to cover in just this one chapter. But I can tell you that when you would node lock, for example, and the in-position player not to be aggressive enough against a small bet or a check, then you would actually have to start building a pot yourself. Besides this fact, like, we still have decent range equity, right? Because there was check on the flop, and we still have a decent nut equity here. We still elect to bet small because we get raised sufficiently. But when we actually look at which hands are interested more in a bet than a check, then this might be surprising, right? Quickly jumping back to the strategy, we saw that the actual betting strategy was just a wild mix of made hands for the most part. In contrast to the big bets, where we saw that a lot of the bluffs are going to be draws, air hands basically, with relatively strong equity. In block bet strategies, most of the bluffs are rather condensed. So they are either like high cards or draws to some degree, but usually like there are not really any absolute trash hands in there, and then we just go a little bit wider with made hands. And sometimes we add in a few high card hands that achieve, for example, cheaper equity realization with their draws, or they can fold out a little bit of equity and not face a very unfavorable scenario of going check bet, and we face a bet that we can't call. So those hands go in there as well. But for the most part, it's just a very merged sizing logic that is built around made hands a lot. In any way, when we look at this range, we can see it's a wild mix of all different kind of pairs. And when we compare the EVs and look for the red colors in here, red meaning these hands are more interested in betting than checking, you can see that it's actually not really the top pairs that are the ones that drive the strategy, but rather the second pair type hands and some specific suits or third pairs, these kind of things. And that is something that is also a very useful and important concept in GTO poker in general, and one that might differ a little bit from reality. So when we check, in position is going to use a huge overbet. Right, he has gained nut advantages again, so sizing is big. He's going to bet very big again. And when he does that, what we are going to have is an indifferent hand with our 9x, with our 7x. Here you can see it very slightly. The 9 is starting to fold, the 7 is clearly starting to fold. So we can also look at EV and we can see that all these hands have kind of lost their EV choosing this line. And a way out of this was to block in the first place. And you can see the clearer blocks here, and the ones that create the EV difference, the ones that have a clear preference, are actually going to be certain pair hands that are indifferent. zero EV against a polarized bet from in position, because when we check, in position is going to either bet stronger hands than ours and bluffs, so we need to call sometimes, but we don't have EV anymore because it polarizes around our hand class. But when we instead choose to block, we will get value from a vast majority of weaker mate hands and even some air hands, like showdownable air hands, ace highs and similar. So blocking in these spots is often the more attractive option for these kind of reasons. This in-position overbet, other double check runhouse, for the most part, it's just relatively dry equity shifts on the turn for in-position. So usually high cards. And you can also see pretty fun logics around here. When you look at which height the high cards is, the better it is, the bigger the bet becomes, for example. You would overbet smaller on a check or whatever. That's also something you can use as a guideline, but I would try to simplify my strategies in practice in a way where you can actually execute it to some degree. But anyway, this is a reason also why we can only block bet, because in position again is building the pot for us in some way too, either by overbetting delayed or raising our block. We have covered the most important mechanics already, and now a few special cases. There are some two Broadway boards which are not like really interested in blocking. Actually, no two Broadway boards are interested in blocking, but just in overbetting for a bunch of reasons. And the thing I wanted to say is these two Broadway boards can either emerge on the turn or have been there on the flop. So it could be a board like Queen 7-6 check, like the one I showed here, but it could also be a board like King Queen 8 flush draw in a brick turn if the in-position player chooses to play an according c-bet strategy. In any case, the driving factor here is that there is no advantage in the medium strength hands for the big blind. And the reason for that is very simple. When you elect block bet strategies, your goal is kind of forcing wider continues by the in-position player, but it is always combined with a trade-off. And when we think back to the example with the 9-7-3-5, we noticed that a lot of the hands that were interested in block betting had additional equity going for them. And that was the main driver why they were blocking in the first place. But in the example of the two Broadway boards, the logic is reversed. When we now block, we are actually not really going to deny equity, but we are going to allow in position to realize equity with a lot of their bottom range, with the remainder air that is usually going to be gut shot type hands. And a lot of them are offsuit, so very high frequency, and they can very happily realize the equity. They can even show aggression against us because some of his hands also improve on the turn. But more importantly, what's going to happen now, he's going to realize his equity. We are going to be out of position, playing on the river. The equity over time is going to be more important. And we are going to play a bigger pot in a spot where in-position's range is going to improve often on the river, and that is just not a scenario we want. You also need to consider that like a check is not really a card that has been claimed yet. So if we wanted to implement a block sizing from the logic before, it would be built around a 7 a lot, and those hands especially are going to suffer against the double overcard plus added equity type hands from a player that's in position, and he's going to hit the check on top of it sometimes with his king check, ace check type hands, pocket checks, and so on and so forth. So what's going to happen is the big blind is never going to have a clear advantage in the medium strength of hands. So betting with a medium strong hand is also not attractive. Betting ranges are exclusively built around the top range, around nut equity, only around big sizings, and medium or small sizes are not attractive at all. And as I said, it doesn't really matter how this spot came to exist. It could have been from the flop or from the turn. So then there's one more logic I wanted to show you. Most dynamic flops kind of are like the connected undercard turns. When you look at the board like Queen 8-6-7 or 7-6-5 King, there are some similarities going on. First of all, we have a lot of different hand classes available to our range that were already there on the flop. We don't only have like the top pairs from 9-7-3 deuce, but we had straights already on the flop. We had a lot of two pairs on the flop. So that allows a wider strategic diversity that we can use. We have different hand classes. We can do different things. And a lot of the stuff we have seen already is going to come into play here. We're going to have a lot of mate hands with additional equity. We have a lot of nuts. We can induce raises when we block bet. But we also have super, super strong hands that want to build a pot right away, especially with certain blockers that are unfavorable for the in-position player. So when we block certain hands, he's not going to raise so often. And for that reason, we need to build a pot ourselves. So we're still going to have a big sizing in contrast to the other overcards or to the other connected turns. But again, it's going to be smaller because the equity over time is not so stable. We want to force in position to continue relatively wide. So on a 9 river, for example, not all of his remaining 8x improve, and we are going to have a very big drop in EV with our range. And then we can also see that we have a lot of hands that rather block bet ourselves, get value from hands that would elect to check back against our check instead, and force in position to build a pot for us as well. So that way we are applying a few logics we've seen already at the same time and leveraging some EV by blocking instead of check calling against a polarized range. A very big contrast to that is a board with extremely stable equity, nut equity for the big blind. So here we had the drips on the flop, and we are basically not interested in doing a lot different than just leveraging that. We can also include some top pairs in our overbetting range, but again, there's no real medium strength hands for the big blind that want to implement an additional strategy. So for that reason here, again, the board is very dry. The nut equity is in big blind's favor, so big sizing is super important. What we see though is we size a bit smaller than on 9-7-3 deuce. We don't just 2x pot all the time, but also downsize a little bit. And the reason for that is mainly that you have your equity is not going to change at all anymore. On 9-7-3 deuce, we had an incentive to fold out the overcards, to create a river spot where we have a low SPR, and in position is not going to hit certain cards anymore really. And here it doesn't really matter. A 6 is just the nuts on the river. And what you're going to do here, even though it's not very visible, you are approaching a geometric bet size, which is B130, because that one will force in position to go broke over turn on river most frequently. And that's what you're trying to achieve here. On also nut equity for big blind, dry board, so very comparable in a way to 9-7-3 deuce, but then again very different in terms of the hand class that is going to produce the bet for the most part. But again, also what I forgot to mention was we overall have less equity because in position checks more hands like pocket queens, checks, tens, a few king eggs on the flop. So yeah, that's also a difference to 9-7-3 deuce. And the rest I already said, there was no equity shifts at all. Equity, the nut equity is still for the big blind, so big bets only. And here especially, it's important to not forget about your future bluffs. It's very easy to just bet flush draws, 7-5, 10-9 type hands. And then when these hands improve on the river, you don't have bluffs left. And good regulars will exploit you by not paying you off on the river anymore. So that leads us to the summary. The starting point on the turn is basically before the turn card is being dealt. In that moment, the big blind has a top range advantage. The whole ranges are usually about equal. It depends a little bit how that manifests on the turn. Overcards, equity shift to big blind to button. No overcard, it remains stable. Sometimes the big blind gains a little bit of EV, especially on draw completers. And the bottom range is always worse for the big blind. He still has a lot of trash on any given board. When the top range advantage remains for the big blind, we always need to have a big sizing. And when we see the equity over time is less stable, like on the more connected boards, we generally need to downsize that big sizing. If there's an equity shift for in position, like the 9-7-3 deuce king, then we need to either check a lot or bet small. If you would look at 9-7-3 ace, for example, you would probably range check almost. And then when you look at big bet strategies, most often your betting selection, especially on try turns, is going to be around top pair type hands, and your bluffs are very natural, for the most part, high equity hands like gut shots, open-enders, flush draws. But don't forget your future bluffs. When these draws improve, you still need air, in theory at least. And small sizings are always a little bit more merged. Rather expanded in the mate hand category, more pairs, weaker pairs, maybe even some showdownable high cards, but not really a lot of unnatural bluffs as well. Now we have briefly covered what you can look out when you study these spots for yourself in GTO Wizard, but of course we need to consider some real-world limitations, and I think the two that are most important I already addressed. First of all, aggression versus leads. Population just doesn't raise enough, so maybe you can play a little bit around with the node lock feature, see what happens if people don't raise you enough, if that changes your sizing choice, for example, in the first place, especially of block bets, and if people bet big enough, do they overbet on try overcard turns? If they don't, what does it do to your strategy? With the AI feature, you have great options to explore that. And then I also want to suggest a few things to expand on, especially the varying degrees of equity shifts in terms of like how does a card connect with the flop. There's often going to be differences in sizing choice and hand choice when you look at boards like 9-7-3 deuce versus 9-7-3 5 or 6 or 8 turn or 3 flush. We have covered all the logics. You're going to need to understand the spots, but the actual strategy differs a lot. So that's definitely something you want to explore yourselves. And also the varying overcards, because they lead to a little bit cleaner or less clean card strategies in terms of blocking and checking, and sometimes implementing something like B50 or B75. Board pairing turns, very similar. I think also we have covered most of the logics that apply there, but they are a little bit differing because it always depends on the nut equity exclusivity. Like not only who has these nuts, but does somebody has them exclusively and the other guy doesn't have them at all, or how is the balance, will usually manifest in a bigger or smaller big sizing. And then really the only way to get better at these things is first understanding the concepts and then drilling. Drilling and drilling again is my recommendation, especially right after these presentations when your knowledge is still fresh. Sit down, take the time to go over this. It's very interesting in poker to always acquire new knowledge, but your game only gets really better if you also practice what you've learned and integrate it in your B game, in your autopilot a little bit more. If you have any questions, leave them in Discord, leave a comment. We will try to get back to you for sure. Feedback on this session is welcome as well. And I am trying to adjust my future seminars on what you guys need, what you guys find most helpful. As I said, was my first one today. I'm very excited to be part of the GTO Wizard team. And I hope that I will provide lots of value to you guys in the future, but it helps me a lot if you guys let me know what kind of content you appreciate as well. Anyway, thank you for watching and being part of this live seminar, and I wish all of you guys good luck at the tables.